You definitely need dedicated people. And the reason I say for go-to-market, you need to dedicate it from the strategy perspective. And then you need to think about, defining that interim execution plan. And then they need to understand your systems really in depth so that you can kind of know what you can do and flex. Because if you're building something and you say, we'll do the front end integration, so maybe we're doing joint quoting together, but the back end systems are separate, and we stitch it back together again, using spreadsheets or data exchanges. Really understanding the limits of that, I think, is having a technical systems, back end lead to cash component of that GTM dream team is really important.
Welcome to M&A Science, where leading M&A practitioners share lessons learned so we can learn from the best. If you're interested in keeping up with the latest from M&A Science, visit mascience.com and subscribe to our free newsletter. Every week, we share highlights of our interviews and invitations to events as we build the greatest community of forward-thinking M&A practitioners. Again, that's mascience.com. I'm your host, Kison Patel, CEO and founder of M&A Science. Joining me today is James Harris, Principal Corporate Development Integration at Google. Google, the multinational technology company that focuses on artificial intelligence, search engine technology, online advertising, cloud computing, computer software, quantum computing, e-commerce, and consumer electronics. Trade on NASDAQ under GOOGL. Today, we're going to talk more about go-to-market integration planning. James, welcome back. How are you?
Always good to see you, Kison, and great to be here, and looking forward to this conversation. So
I'm so glad we bribed you to get you back so we can keep talking about more go-to-market stuff, because it's the thing I'm getting a good sense of, that when we do a deal, we don't want to screw that up.
It's a tough part, and it's I'm a former engineer, so I thought engineering was tough, and then as I started getting into looking at how the go-to-market pieces are, it's considerably more complex, and it's finding really good go-to-market team members that have done this before. That is a key thing to always look for. I mean, yes. If you have an opportunity and you're in go-to-market tools and you get to do an M&A, I'd suggest it, because it's like, once you know how to do this, it's an amazing opportunity for you.
Yeah, we're going to jump into it. If anybody wants to learn the background of James, listen to one of the other podcasts we've already have published. It's a little funny because we've had some time since our last conversation, so we aren't doing this back to back, but we may hopefully publish them back to back. I wanted to click down, because last time we spoke a lot of high level on shaping the thesis and initial planning approach around the go-to-market integration. When we start clicking down into it, what does that look like? How are you thinking through front end, back end? What is that? How do you even think about it in general?
It's a multifaceted piece. I think there's the first piece I always think about is you always should be thinking about what's the customer journey and what is happening to those customers, because I think that should always be kind of your go-to North Star to go back to as you think about these pieces, because there is a lot of complexity. Like, how do I put two lead tracking tools together? How do I put two comp systems together? How do I even merge two customer bases and Salesforce pieces? And every time you're thinking about those, I always kind of go back to, okay, let's put together a plan. Let's think about how we do that. But then let's go back and talk to the customer, think about how this experiences with the customers. And I think the general other rule of thumb I've seen, and I've been on both sides of this a couple of times, is as a customer that's worked with companies that have been acquired or are emerging, I'm okay with seeing a little bit of duality for about a year, because it happens. There's a lot of things that happen. So maybe I have to work with two sales forces, or sign two contracts, or have two billing cycles. I kind of feel like a year is okay. If you're taking more than a year, then, as a customer, I'm like, did you really get this done right? And so that's kind of from a customer perspective, those are kind of the outside pieces. And then I think the next kind of pieces that you need to think through, which are always challenging, is what can you do right off the bat? Because I think you have two sales forces that are eager to work together. So how do you incent them and get them to kind of be joint sales? Because there's usually an awful lot of immediate opportunities there. And the more you can get both sales forces working together, There's also a magical moment of, keeping both sales forces in play. You kind of have two sales forces and they're not really working together, and you kind of have an us and them thing that just doesn't do very well. So I think that's like the first short, super tactical pieces. And some of that can be like joint lead passing, joint sales calls. You need to think about how you incent both sales forces to sell and work together. I think those are all tricky things. A lot of times companies will think about SPIFs, and SPIFs are a great tool, but SPIFs are also kind of have some limitations, because if you make a really big SPIF, you're paying a lot of money for maybe what's a small transaction. And if you make a really small SPIF for a joint deal, then you may be incenting people for something that they would have made a much bigger deal, much more upside on if they work together. And then I think the other piece that you have to think through is, if your M&A doesn't come on nice calendar years, and so you have a existing sales force that is the inbound company, and then you as the host company have your own existing sales force with plans, territories, quotas, all those lovely things, and you can't just merge them at once. I mean, if you did that, it would be really disruptive, because the odds of both territories mapping exactly the same, the odds of how you pay out on different kinds of sizes of deals and transactions are probably going to be about zero, that they're going to exactly match. So you have to think about how you operate in this interim phase until your next calendar year, because sales cycles work always in annual processes, and that's when everybody gets their quota and their territories and all those good things kind of handed out. So if you're closing a deal or in the early half of the year, you've got some time to figure this out. If you're closing it in the last half of the year, you have to make a real quick decision. Do I do it like in the first of the year? If I'm closing a deal in Q4, boy, that's awfully tight. Can I do everything to merge the sales forces together, or do I have to wait a whole year? And so this drives some pretty big strategic thinking that you have to think around of what does that mean? If we keep the sales forces, separate for 18 months, that would be kind of maybe the most extreme. What does that mean as far as joint sales? What does that mean back to that customer experience? So you have to kind of play these out very early to kind of think through what's best for you from the customer's perspective, what's best for you from your revenue driving perspective, and then what's best for how fast your systems and tools can adopt to do that. Some companies I've seen have amazing, great onboarding processes so that they could actually take a company in Q4 and map it all in and have it all together, and then have joint sales in one quarter. But most companies, this is not a core set of competencies, and I think it takes a little bit of time to build up the tools and the people and the know-how to do that. So sorry, that was a long answer, but there's a lot that you have to kind of look at because you're kind of thinking about how to build a plan.
Yeah, I think I got three big chunks around this. There's this customer journey that paints the picture.
Yeah.
And you have your actual sales team getting people oriented to wanting to work together and aligned. And some of the things around that with the alignment financially, the comp and so forth. And then driving it operationally, the technology, and figuring that part out as its own track as well.
Yeah, I think marrying all three, and back to the people and the sales forces. When you said that, I actually remember after doing several integrations at another company and working with a regular sales force, the head of sales said, just think about the sales team as anytime you touch my territory or commission, you're messing with my food bowl. I thought that was kind of you just brought it down to a real tactile piece. And I think it's right, because it's like, look, this is how I make my living. And if you're changing all those things, you're really impacting how I make my living. And I think that it's back to that key sales piece, because the sales force, they're the ones that are going out and finding the customers. They're the ones that are winning the deals. So you do have to work very closely with them so that they don't feel like that they're getting more food in their food bowl, not taking any food out.
That's a fair point. What do you do to do that?
So I've seen a couple things. I mentioned SPIFs. There are some companies that I've actually seen.
Can you explain a SPIF too? I like the way it sounds, but
yeah. A SPIF is a cash incentive that is paid out if the two sales forces work to close a deal jointly. So there's a kind of a qualification point where, like, hey, company A, inbound company and host company have identified customer A. Now we've engaged, we created a joint opportunity, and then we said, okay, we're going to go out and sell, and we sell and close the deal. Then both sales teams get, the regular commissions on whatever parts of the, joint pieces. Company A, inbound company got some commission, and host company got some commission, but they both get a cash incentive on top of it. And that does work depending on the size of the transaction and the volume. Sometimes SPIFs work really well. If they're very large curated deals, SPIFs are kind of hard to set the right SPIF, because some of these deals could be very expensive or very lucrative from the sales perspectives. And so you have to kind of get the right incentives. And back to kind of the sales team, some of them will be like, I can make, X dollars on my SPIF, or I can wait till it's in my territory, and then I can get full compensation, and I get quota relief, and I can get, extra kickers on, oftentimes sales forces have extra kickers to sell new products. So sometimes there's a little bit of gaming the system from the sales force to kind of wait so that they can maximize their return on the sale. So you have to be thoughtful about that. And actually, I think having a really good partner in the sales organization where you can sit down and kind of say, hey, this is what our strategy is. Will that work? How will it be gained in a positive or a negative way? I think having those kind of scenarios thought through is really, really important. And sometimes SPIFs will work. I've actually seen some companies just say, I'll give double comp. So if the inbound team and the host team both sell products, they both get each other's commissions. So you get kind of double commission. And that's a very bold move because it's pretty expensive. But you definitely have a very highly incented joint sales force to work together selling the same products.
How does that work, double commission? Because if they sell their product, you just get their commission, and then vice versa?
So you're paying twice. Yeah, so you're paying twice. So if I sell, an example is this, if I sell widget A, and I get, my commission is $5, I'm going to keep it really simple. And then, the host company is selling widget B, and that commission is $10. So if I'm the salesperson in the host company, I get paid $10, and the target company gets paid $5. But by double comping them, both of them would get $15.
Oh wow!
So it is very expensive from a just pure cash outlay, but you certainly have a lot of people incented then to and particularly the inbound company, it's like, hey, I just tripled my commission. Where that works really well is if you're trying to establish a customer base, because once you've kind of done that, you can build and this kind of gets back to your deal thesis and models. Maybe you want to think about, that's a lot of cost to acquire customers, but once you've acquired those customers, then you have upsell opportunities, cross-sell opportunities, a lot of those things. So it gets into some real key, I would say, financial and corporate strategy that you have to think through. And I would say SPIFs are kind of on the low end, double comp is on the high end, and then sometimes you can find some other ways to kind of find graduated incentives in between. But those are kind of the two bookends that you see often being used. So, double comp is kind of a little unusual. I'll be candid. Yeah.
What about the customers? What are you doing with them throughout this? Do you engage with them? Do you sort of get their?
So it's a great question. I think the first one is you really need to reach out to all customers immediately and kind of at the close of the deal and say, hey, we're excited about this. Set some expectations like, hey, every transaction that's going forward will continue. There's no changes. There's a lot of times people are like, oh, wait a minute, did I just negotiate this great agreement? And now the host company is going to come in and say, I'm going to change all the terms. I think that's really important to communicate that it's, business as usual, because you want your customer base to have good security. And then I think you have to, I think in every transaction that I've done of any substance or size, I think it's really important to have both companies call down on key accounts and just do that personal outreach. I've seen it with, the host company doing a call and then the inbound company doing a call. I think that works. I think it's really nice to see both sales forces call at the same time, because it's like, hey, we're joint, we're together. So I think there's definitely a key call down for like major accounts, key accounts in flight that I think are really important to do. And then I think it's just being really transparent and open with the customer base of, hey, until date X or Y or Z, it's still kind of like we're two companies, and still, the products will be working together. We're working together on the products, but you may have two billing cycles. You may have two, separate contracts. Just being completely transparent and open with the customer, so there's no surprises, is just the best path. I mean,
yeah. Okay. That get the communication. I like the approaches that you outlined with really being able to engage with that, and then probably recapping the narrative on why this is going to be great for everybody. The mechanical parts.
Oh, mechanical parts. That is a great question. No two companies I've ever seen, and I've probably done something like over 100 transactions, have a complete one-to-one mapping when you even call the same customer. And it can be something like, I'll just pick on Boeing. There could be Boeing, there could be the Boeing company, there could be Boeing Inc. and their Salesforce systems, and each one of those three would be very valid customer identifications. But you now have to map the host company's definitions with whatever the target company used. And that always, that's like a general deep mapping exercise that you really have to have very quickly, so that you're using the same language and talking to the same. And in some cases, you may have different contacts within the company, and that's totally great and fine. But you may actually have two different ways of calling the company in your internal sales tracking systems that you need to make sure align. And that is always a first order business to kind of make sure you've got a matching, so that when you talk to them, you start using the same language. And that's also a first step towards, at some point, the inbound contracts will get merged with the host company's contracts. So there's a contract conversion period of time that you have to kind of think about moving off the inbound company's paper to the host company's paper. No acquiring company has ever been happy with an inbound company's terms and conditions and things like that, because oftentimes it's a bigger company with a smaller company, and the bigger company has a different set of risk criteria or profiles, or or there can be even simple things like some companies will be net 30, and others will be net 60 as far as payments. So you have to, start beginning to align those key mechanics around kind of how you work with the customer, and setting those principles up very early. And then you have to think about when you do sales, when you start converting the customers over to your paper. So those are bigger nitty issues, I guess.
Well, I mean, I feel like we're limiting our scope here, because there's a broader sense of go-to-market that would incorporate your quote to cash, your client success,
Yes.
your marketing, and
all those.
We'll have separate podcast interviews for each of those, I guess.
No, those are all very deep conversations, and I will have to say that they're fine. I understand the big pieces, but making sure quote to cash systems really connect and connect and work in the same tools. Those are really highly specialized knowledge bases and understandings. Yeah.
Okay. On the one thing I wanted to get a better understanding was with the sellers, right? We want to keep them happy. We have some financial incentives, but on the operational side, we're looking for that right time to do a cutover and to merge the actual CRMs together. There's probably a lot of training and things around that. So that might not happen in a very controlled way. It's got to be planned well.
Yes.
Or I should say it's not going to happen in an impulsive manner.
It's going to be impulsive.
It's going to be well planned out. What about the sellers? If they're trying to run cross sells and things of that sort, they don't want to bump head on customers and things, are they sitting there with two laptops? How do you figure out the solution for the time being?
At the front end, it is as a friend of mine affectionately referred to it as a three-legged sales call. You have two salespeople going in together and jointly working with both products and both jointly pitching both products at the same time. So you almost have double teams. And that really, until you get to a common quote system, a common, lead to cash quote and, fulfillment system, you kind of have to operate that way. I think you're spot on about that has to be very thoughtful in its planning and execution, because you have to think about how you're going to merge the two systems and then make some transitional cutovers as far as you are touching with the sales tools and sales processes and, quotes and approvals and all those lovely workflows that you have to then merge into one. Most of the time, it usually is the host company's tools. Although there's been several times where I've looked at, inbound companies and we've learned some unique ways of how they have engaged with the customers. It's like, ooh, we should borrow from that. So there's a little bit of a rationalization of like two business practices that you have to go through. Does take time. I mean, it's not most of these ERP, or lead to cash systems those transitions usually are 6, 12, 18, 24 months. 6 is really for a very small company and maybe a small number of, small number of leads. That's about the fastest I've ever seen it done.
Wouldn't you be inclined to try to get it done as quick as you can?
You do want to move as fast as you can. And that the key piece there is making sure that you identify dedicated resources to the transition from both teams. The operations team, the challenge is that oftentimes operational teams have been leaned out to get as efficient and financially fiscal as possible. And so you have two very lean teams trying to kind of do 3 things at once: inbound company sales and tools, host company sales and tools, and now we have to merge. So oftentimes that does require some investing in resources and teams to do that work. If you're a serial acquirer, that's a core set of competencies that you want to build up, and you want to have an onboarding team that does that and thinks that through. And oftentimes, in some very high level cases, I think Cisco's in a marvel at this, is they have an onboarding team that thinks constantly about how to take in companies, bring them into their systems incredibly fast, so that transition goes really quick. But they've invested a lot into that process, so that and they've built their systems up from the ground up for that intake perspective, which I think is also sometimes a bit of an overhaul from an infrastructure perspective, that you have to make that investment. I think that's a really key piece, particularly if you're doing a lot of serial acquisitions of companies that have inbound revenue streams. If you're tech deals and you're just tucking them in, that's a different kind of, it's a lot less complex, I guess.
How do you do that? How do you balance the assumptions to your ability to actually execute?
I think the reality has been it starts out in theory, and then it's always hard to prove until you've done a first few transactions. And then everybody sees, ooh, this is a lot more complex. So to me, the value of post-close reviews, how did things work? Where could we have done better? Those are incredibly instrumental in building the case for the investment for future core infrastructure team. I think and then I think for the first few times you do it, you really have to think about, how do you build a repeatable process? I mean, in some ways it's like just core M&A. Anytime you're adding new things, new changes to your business, you have to build out an M&A team to address these. But an M&A systems integration team is incredibly important. You can augment it sometimes with contractors and consultants if it's kind of just arms and legs and heavy lifting, but you still have to have this core knowledge of your core businesses, systems, and the why you've built them that way. I think that's incredibly important. Getting to the how and doing can be things that you can maybe bring in extra help, but really understanding the core whys, because they're often driven by deep-seated business, legal, compliance rationale that you just have to be very acutely aware of.
These post-close reviews, we know oftentimes turn into more items to add to the checklist, basically.
Yes.
What other things can you do to help retain knowledge? Any other specific deliverables or assets?
I think there's two things there. It's a great one to keep in mind. Is oftentimes that team, if you're investing in a series of program managers and engineers and systems analysis people, you can keep that team for key business transformation efforts too. Not sometimes you may be wanting to upgrade your core back end ERP systems. So that's the same team. You can use that same team, that same knowledge, that same skill set. I think that's one way to kind of help justify it when you're not doing a lot of deals. The other way, I'm a huge fan of this, if you're doing fairly episodic transactions, but they're very large, or you're just building up that knowledge base, is tabletop exercises. In some companies, as we knew we needed to build it, but we didn't. The pipeline we were building, but the pipeline wasn't there yet. We ran quarterly deal scenarios. We picked a company that we kind of thought was sort of interesting. Oftentimes we pick the first one. I always recommend pick a softball just to kind of run through the process and make sure you kind of figure out how it can work, and then start picking some that are like, maybe multiple regions, or maybe it's multiple regions always adds a whole nother complexity because you're contracting in multiple languages. You have different entities sometimes that you have to serve the contracts out of. So that just adds another layer of complexity. Then, maybe layer in that you're going to keep 80% of the company in end of life 20%. So now you have an acquisition and a divestiture or a wind down. How would you do all those things? Then think about, think about your joint integration sales motions. Is this the add-on, like you're selling A and B and it makes a better customer experience? Or is it truly a merger? Because those are kind of different points that you want to think through. You may have two products at one point, you're selling them separately, then you're kind of selling them together, but eventually they fold into one. How do you think about that customer migration and change? I start simple, and then when you kind of run into an area like, ooh, that was really scary, to me that's the one that I want to do the next tabletop exercise on, because then just like it does two things. One, you figure out what you need to do. Two, it takes the fear out of whatever that was, so that you'll be ready for it the next time. So
that's pretty cool. Hopefully marketing picks that up. We can write a little play out of it.
Yeah, we run a lot of tabletop exercises here at Google. Just to test the systems or test the processes. I think
I'm telling you, we'll write it up. We'll add it to the Agile M&A framework. We'll get James Harris's play table exercise.
I think it's also a good way to kind of just, there are peaks and troughs in M&A. So it's a way to kind of take advantage of it. And so, yeah.
On the tabletop exercise, can we walk through that in just like a step-by-step? We have those plays because it would be nice to actually write one and give the credit. It's like, how would you walk through that in terms of, just doing the prep, who do you have involved, and the steps?
So I think there's kind of two levels of the tabletop exercise that I would think about. There's one is like a high level deal capacity. Do we want to think about doing deals this way? Kind of tabletop exercise. And then I'd say there's another kind of tabletop exercise of like, I really want to exercise in extreme a certain work stream or a certain set of processes. So both of them have their cases. For the first one, I often, the best way to do this is like create a fake company and say, we're going to buy, and I usually give it a code name, just like everything else. And, it's like, here's the company, here's the product, here's the revenue, here's the number of entities, here's just kind of like the basic high level things you get in an early due diligence session. And then then we're going to take it and put it in, product area A and maybe product area B. And then you have your key cross-functional team members, your people from finance, accounting, legal, HR, all the different kind of core domains. And you say, what information would you need you need more of? Let's figure that out. Where do you see immediate risks that would give you concerns? And where do you see that there's like easy things we could be doing? And kind of spend some time just making sure you're identifying those things. And then the next question is what do you do about those? Ideally, I want us not have more questions on the due diligence list, but I want to ask, like, do we have a follow-on diligence session to have a deep dive around, like, how does this work? Do we set up a meeting where we have these conversations, and what would that agenda look like? Those things. Oftentimes, and whatever I would do for those meta ones is like test core assumptions. Like, you always, some companies acquire technology and shut it down and then refold it in. So what would happen if we didn't shut it down and we wanted to keep the product in market for a period of time? Take the converse of whatever your normal operations are. Pick one, maybe two, and that way you can kind of test those edges. Oftentimes your sponsors are already kind of testing those edges or asking those questions. So sometimes you can just, they said, well, could we do like 3 deals at once and kind of do a string of pearls strategy? That's like, that's a good question. So do a tabletop exercise. What would happen if we did 3 deals at once and we wanted to combine it into one product? That's worth thinking through. So that's kind of more the meta stage. The other one would be more of that, like the go-to-market function in particular. So we're buying a subscription product. It's billed annually. It has, these kinds of add-ons that can be done and those kinds of structure. And maybe those are things that you just don't do. Maybe you're doing capacity building, or maybe you just do a site license. Ask that question and then say, how would we build the systems? What would it take to build those systems? What would break if we did this? And really, spend the time testing that all the way out, so that when somebody says, okay, you're a site license company, and now you want to go into the subscription business, it's like, we can do it, but it means these things we have to invest in these things. We have to, get a team in to build that infrastructure. I often mind the things that didn't go so well. What would we do better next time? Okay, we all agree that, we didn't do a great job of account mapping. How would we do that differently? And really game it all the way out, But yeah, create fictitious companies. Be very careful, because sometimes those can create internal rumors. Don't make them look too much like one company, because everybody likes to try to add, figure out if that a real deal or not a real deal. But I do think that that's a great way to kind of just keep testing.
Yeah, and is that where it is? Is there anything takeaways? Any like things that are produced out of it? Any little steps to this?
I insist that there's always a new practice rewritten, or a new process, or a new set of functions that we either need to develop or create. In some cases, we've recognized that, oh, wow, we could actually bring whole parts of the due diligence process that we kind of do maybe post-close in early. If we ask these right questions, or we set up this kind of detailed conversation. So I always insist in some form of, I want to say, integration toolbox artifact being created. That is like a process change, or a new set of tools, or a new set of joint cross-functional team, specs, requirements, those things. And then we say, we created this. Now in the next 2 to 3 deals that fit this criteria, we're going to use it. And then we're going to agree if this makes sense or makes things better or not. So we'll just actively know what we, was it the right thing to do or not the right thing to do?
Yeah, that's really makes a lot of sense. Who's all involved with this? So
for the core ones, I usually bring in my cross-functional leads. They're usually the directors of the different teams. Although in some cases, they volunteer their junior members, because it's a good way for them to kind of get up to speed without having to do a deal. So it can be both ways. And then for if you're going into a deep area of joint lead paths or any of those things, bring in the domain experts, and I don't make those plays super long. I usually set up a hypothetical, give people a day or two, because it's simulating a deal, to internalize whatever it is. And then 1 or 2 working sessions that are maybe an hour or 2, where we kind of pick at something, go at it, figure it out, write up some action items, try to build some artifacts, maybe meet back in a couple of days to finish those artifacts or test them out, and then, move on. I mean, so I don't want to take teams out of the field for very long at all, because I think it should be something that you can do, maybe over the course of 2 weeks.
Yeah, I was going to ask like time and frequency. So you would say 2 weeks, and how many times are you meeting in a 2 week period?
2-3 times, maybe, depending on what it is.
For an hour, or 2 hours?
Hour, 2 hours. I mean, usually the first meeting is a couple hours, because you're laying out the case, you're laying out the, the pieces, and there's usually a good set of Q&A that either you have the answer or you have to make up on the fly so that everybody knows what the rules are. And then, you then have a couple working sessions, and then kind of a couple kind of circle backs. I don't really like to put people in a room for a week and then come out with something. That's just too disruptive.
Okay. And then you got a couple more sessions, and then you create these things. How many times a year would you do this exercise?
Probably, right now we do, I mean, depends on deal volume. If you have active streams, it's hard to do this. If you've got like a trough, definitely put 1 or 2 in that period. If you got kind of a quarter, like in some businesses, you don't do transactions in Q4 because you just can't, there's everything, it's an all hands on deck kind of thing. That's a great time to do it. If there's a period, I try to at least run 1 or 2, and we do a lot of deals here at Google a year. Just pick 1 or 2 scenarios and run them.
Okay.
So,
what's the best advice you have for execution of all this?
Execution. Well, for going back to the go-to-market component, remember your customer. Think about what you're doing to the customer. I think that is the most key thing. And just because, and don't expose your internal difficulties, should not be exposed to the customer. I guess it's the other kind of key piece is, you should, there may be duct tape and baling wire as you stitched all these things together, but the customer should never see that.
All right. Stay focused on the customer.
Yeah, I think that's really, I mean, it's a, think about it. You've proven the product, you've negotiated the price, and then it's like a really difficult thing to get the product in and set and, using it. Boy, that's just, don't do that. Because those mechanics, that's all the mechanics that go to market, lead to cash infrastructure. So, yeah.
Do you ever find like undo moments where you sort of did something and had to undo it? And
we have run into some cases where you've thought your joint marketing or your ad campaigns were going to be the right ones, and they just fell on deaf ears. Then you've got to regroup and rethink that and reset it really quick. And that can trickle all the way back up to your deal thesis. We were expecting to make X dollars in the first quarter, and we just couldn't get their attention. Well, then, boy, we need to think about it. Now we're X in the hole. We need to think about what that means. Or does that mean that there's a pivot that you have to think through? Is that a pivot in messaging? Is it a pivot in target customers? Those are all questions I think you have to rethink. There is the ultimate horribly painful thing is did you buy the wrong thing? I mean, that sometimes happens.
Yep.
And so, the question then is, how do you test enough times to know when you stop testing and realize you bought the wrong thing? I think that's a tough balance.
I want to go back to the sales team and making sure they're actually aligned to go to market together. How do you test that out and get a sense of their readiness?
It's a tough question, because it really, there's an interesting intersection, because oftentimes, product management is driving these kind of ideas or transactions. So in some ways, that's like, in theory, this adding these two teams together will be great, but in practice, that may not be so hot. They just have different sales actions, or they just work with customers very differently. I think there's a really good opportunity. I think this is something, I've talked to other people outside of Google and encouraging them to think about the same issue. It doesn't hurt to partner with these types of companies beforehand, because if you're partnering and then you're doing joint selling, then you're doing kind of joint customer engagement. And if you're partnering well and you're working well and your customers really like working with both of you, that's a pretty good sign that you'll not have that friction. So, I think it is, or if you can't partner, then you start looking at, okay, what contracts, customers do we know are we working in, both teams are working in already. It's you can't always get the inbound companies pre-close, customer list, but you can kind of do a little sleuthing around and see, oh yeah, that other company is in the same accounts as ours. And just ask, how do you like working with them? It does, a good salesperson can always ask a lot of good questions and get a lot of information. And I think that's a way to kind of figure out and test. Because it is tough. I don't think it's risk. I think you have to be candid that, if it's there's kind of, one of my sales friends refers to as whale hunting, and then there's farming. And, if you're going after these big, huge accounts and that's your culture, but the other company is like farming, well, that's a big difference as far as just sales motions and sales activities. If you're, just watch for those kinds of big deltas, because, if that's the case, then I would raise my hand as an integration person and say, they do things really different, and we need to think that through. It may be right, because maybe we need to do whale hunting and farming, but you need to be very mindful that that's what you're doing.
Yeah, that's one that you have to dig into and really have a qualitative view to understand that that's going to work out right.
Yeah,
just look at the CRM data.
Yeah, and oftentimes, it depends, and actually the customer support data sometimes is also not a bad place to go look, because how many customer cases do you work that are, your customer support team is working, and that product shows up in your customer support cases. Now, it could be a good thing or a bad thing, but you do get some data there. So, yeah.
The team to go the team you developed to do the integration, and you sort of had the broad integration plan and team, but specifically for making sure go-to-market doesn't get screwed up. How do you build that go-to-market integration dream team?
I think it's, you definitely need dedicated people. And the reason I say for go-to-market, you need to dedicate it from the strategy perspective. And then you need to think about, defining that interim execution plan. And then they need to understand your systems really in depth, so that you can kind of know what you can do and flex. Because if you're building something and you say, we'll do the front end integration, so maybe we're doing joint quoting together, but the back end systems are separate, and we stitch it back together again, using spreadsheets or data exchanges. Really understanding the limits of that, I think, is having a technical systems, back end lead to cash component of that GTM dream team is really important. And then I'd say the whole other area here is the lead to cash generation component, which we haven't talked much about. It's the marketing side. How do they reach out and contact the customers? Is it sales conferences? Is it, on-site visits? Is it, what drives the sales motions there? And really understanding that, because you want to make sure that both marketing machines are working well together and not sending mixed messages. And so, how do you make sure, the inbound team is, incenting people to go look at the host company, and the host company is then sending people to go look at the inbound team, because oftentimes you still have two websites, you still have two sales conferences, you may even have, user groups, all those great things. You really need to make sure you're doing as much cross-pollination as possible. And that takes really creative marketing people to think about, how do we tune our message so it's us instead of them plus us. So yeah, the big we, I should say. Yeah.
Well, that's a fair point. So we want some dedicated resources in those areas that can pick up front and back end within our sales cycle.
And then I think that the other piece there is because that whole value chain from lead to cash and actually bulk booking and financial reporting is very detailed. You need to cultivate a series of subject matter expertise in those each domains, as that whole value chain that goes through the organization, that are M&A prepared, is the way I would say this, so that they understand what M&A is. They understand that it's going to come in sideways, and they're going to be people that are interested in solving problems and looking for solutioning. So you're building up that cohort of resources that you can tap when you say, hey, you do monthly subscriptions, this is annual subscriptions. Is that going to cause a big difference as far as products? Having a SME that you can say, oh no, that's not that's just a field in a database, to, oh no, that's like triggers all these other things down the road. Having those resources are just incredibly important, even in the early scoping stage, because you still may be deciding to buy the company because of a lot of synergies from the business and technology perspective and customer experience. But that operational friction, it's good to highlight that early so that people understand, so that it's not assumed that it will be a slam dunk. I think that's really important to kind of set reasonable expectations. So
you make all this sound way too easy, my friend.
Oh no, there's a lot of questions. I think there's a lot of I would say that there's a lot of eagerness to do the right thing. There's a lot of excitement to try to bring things in. I think the piece there is as that's going forward, you have to have a sense of optimism, because you want to keep it, people working towards it. But you have to inject a sense of what I would refer to as healthy skepticism, of like, have we done that? Have we tested that? Do we really know that that'll work? Those are nice ways to kind of just make sure there aren't surprises, or getting a little bit more detail around it. I think is really important. I mean, this is a devil's in the details kind of workflow that you just have to either have those people that you can kind of answer them really quick, or you have to go back and kind of test, or back to tabletop exercises or even simulations. Just, is that even possible? Because I think there's always an optimism. Sure, it's possible. And then like, okay, so show me, how would that work? And sometimes that helps, particularly in the tabletop exercises, just sort those things out. Or it's like, oh, gee, I thought that would work really well, but when we did that, it broke all these things down here downstream that we just didn't think about, because they're usually very complex systems. So, anytime somebody says, oh, we'll do it right away, I'm like, who's saying we'll do it right away? And do we have the right people in the room that can actually do that? Because sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And I think it's just really important to make sure you're really testing that.
I like that healthy skepticism. James, what's the craziest thing you've seen in M&A?
Seen a lot of crazy things. I will say, and this is 11 years ago, I come back to it even today. It was a company that we brought in because we wanted to do due diligence, and it was a good sized company, and we brought them all in to have a series of conversations for a week. And it was the first time the entire company had ever been in the same room. And they had all worked remote. I mean, today that's kind of new and novel, or not novel, but I remember, I was all primed to do all the due diligence meetings and have these conversations, and it was realized they have to kind of like just get it out of their system that they need to like talk to, saying, oh, you're much taller than you are, I didn't know about this, and just kind of almost socialize for a bit. So I gave them an hour to kind of just go socialize, just get this out of your system, and then we'll go back and do our business. But that was just, that was just like, it was just, and the piece that was most interesting is that they had been fronting themselves very well in English, but most of them were not native English speakers because they were using translation software, because it was all remote. So when we got into the room, we had to give time for things to get written in translation software so that we could get the answer, because there was just a language barrier there that you didn't see in email exchanges or in chat sessions, because they were really good at it. So, it's just, it was a surprising moment.
That was a surprise for you.
Yeah, a complete surprise. Yeah, it was like, we were like on to moving, and I'm like, okay, got to let them socialize, which is great. And then I realized, two of the really great engineers, and we brought them in, didn't speak very good English, natively, but they could understand it. They could understand the question, but, just they were very conscious of.
Yep.
It took them a while to get conscious of the grammar, and it's like, these are engineers, no one's going to pick on that.
That's an interesting surprise.
Yeah.
James, thank you so much for taking the time, continuing our conversation. It's a big deal. You're helping me become a better M&A scientist. What more could I ask for?
Well, it's always fun to talk with you, and I always appreciate these conversations because they, it reminds me that we really need to get this information out to the larger groups, because these are hard problems to solve, and they're not new. We just need to learn from each other. So yeah,
that's what all M&A science is all about. So we thank you for dedicating your donating your time to this cause. Yeah. And those of you still listening, thank you for staying in. That's a good applaud for. We look at the data, right? Not everybody goes until the end of the podcast. So I think I forget what it was, 25-30% listen all the way through.
Oh, that's awesome. That's
something like that, which is actually pretty good for what it is, because I don't follow the 20-minute rule for intention on these things. Anyways, till next time, here's to the deal.
Yeah.